It's a privilege to be here with you today. Now, most of you know me as a neuroscientist and professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. But beyond the lab, what truly drives me is the pursuit of protocols that empower people. Not hacks, not gimmicks, but evidence-based, sustainable practices that recalibrate the brain and body toward health, resilience, and purpose. Today, I want to share something both remarkably simple and profoundly transformative. We're going to talk about 6 small daily habits. And while they may sound minor at first, they hold the capacity to radically alter the trajectory of your life in as little as 21 days. Why 21 days? Because while popular culture has tossed around that number, neuroplasticity research shows that consistent, deliberate action over roughly 3 weeks lays the neural groundwork for lasting behavioral change. So let's not waste time. I'm going to give you 4 foundational keynotes that frame this process. These aren't theories. They're rooted in biological mechanisms, in how your nervous system adapts, primes behavior, and governs your perceptions and action. Implement them, and you're not just creating new habits, you're rewiring your brain, shifting your physiology, and reclaiming agency over your life. Now, when people attempt massive life overhauls, like deciding to exercise 2 hours a day, meditate for an hour, overhaul their diet overnight, what happens is they place an enormous, unsustainable load on circuits that haven't been sufficiently prepared. The brain resists this, not because it's lazy, but because sudden, extreme demands signal stress and threat to the nervous system. This triggers homeostatic mechanisms designed to preserve baseline function, not to support abrupt, drastic change. You end up fighting your biology. What works better, and has been validated in both animal models and human studies, is small, repeatable actions. It's these micro behaviors executed daily that signal to the brain, this is relevant. Pay attention. Strengthen this circuit. The technical term for this is Hebbian plasticity. Neurons that fire together, wire together. When you perform a small behavior repeatedly, it leads to a phenomenon called long-term potentiation, LTP, where the synaptic connections between neurons become stronger, more efficient. Over time, this lowers the energetic cost of the behavior, making it feel more automatic, less effortful. Now, why does this matter for you? Because the path to changing your life isn't through sporadic, heroic efforts. It's through consistency. It's through showing up every day for small behaviors that align with the identity you're trying to build. If you want to become someone who's calm under pressure, it's not about attending a silent retreat once a year. It's about taking 2 minutes every morning to sit with your breath. If you want to be physically resilient, it's not about doing an ultra marathon next weekend. It's about moving your body daily, even for 5 minutes, in a way that raises your heart rate and mobilizes your joints. One of the most important things to grasp is that small behaviors accumulate. They create a compounding effect, not just in the outcomes they produce, but in the structural and functional changes they induce in the brain. There's a principle in neurobiology called metaplasticity, the idea that the more plastic your brain becomes through small, regular changes, the more receptive it is to further change. In other words, success breeds success. Each small habit you integrate makes the next one easier to adopt. This is why people who start exercising regularly often begin sleeping better, eating more consciously, and managing stress more effectively. The initial habit primes the nervous system for additional adaptive behaviors. Another critical mechanism at play here is dopamine signaling. Dopamine isn't just a pleasure molecule, it's a molecule of motivation and reinforcement. Small daily actions that are meaningful to you trigger modest dopamine releases, which reinforce the behavior by creating a positive feedback loop. This loop increases the likelihood you'll repeat the behavior tomorrow. Over time, this dopaminergic reinforcement contributes to the consolidation of new habits at the neurochemical level. Consider this, even a 2-minute habit practiced daily can induce measurable changes in brain function and structure if done consistently. Studies using functional MRI have shown that brief daily mindfulness practices, for example, can alter activity in brain regions associated with attention, emotion regulation, and self-referential processing within just a few weeks. Another example is deliberate breathing practices. A simple 1-minute protocol of cyclic sighing, 2 inhales followed by a long exhale, performed daily can reduce anxiety, lower resting heart rate, and shift autonomic balance toward parasympathetic dominance. Again, the action is brief, but its consistent repetition recruits neuroplastic changes in areas of the brainstem, prefrontal cortex, and limbic system involved in stress regulation. What's most empowering about this is that you don't need perfect conditions, elaborate equipment, or massive time investments to begin rewiring your brain. You just need consistency and intent. The threshold for neural change is far lower than most people assume, but the prerequisite is regularity. It's not about the number of minutes you practice, but the number of days you show up. Your nervous system was built to adapt. Its default state is one of plasticity in response to repeated experiences. When you understand this, you realize that the small, daily actions you might otherwise dismiss as insignificant are in fact the most reliable vehicles for personal transformation. Every time you perform a behavior, you're voting for the kind of person you want to become, and you're instructing your brain to wire itself in alignment with that identity. This isn't motivational fluff, it's neurobiological fact. Small, repeatable actions unlock plasticity, shape behavior, and change lives. The path to any significant, enduring transformation runs through the ordinary moments you choose to show up for yourself. And while you won't notice the effects in a single day, over weeks and months, the cumulative impact of these tiny, intentional choices reshapes not just your habits, but the very architecture of your mind and body. If you've ever noticed how some days you can't wait to train, read, or create, while on others you can barely summon the will to shower, what you're really experiencing is a shift in your internal state. The context around you might be the same responsibilities, the same opportunities, but your state has changed, and so your behavioral tendencies shift with it. Neuroscience confirms that the brain operates on a principle called state-dependent processing. What this means is that the brain prioritizes certain actions, perceptions, and cognitive patterns based on your internal state. In a heightened sympathetic state, marked by increased heart rate, cortisol release, and a narrowed attentional focus, your brain primes you for defensive, survival-oriented behaviors: fight, flight, or freeze. Creative thinking, long-term planning, and reflective decision-making become biologically suppressed because they are metabolically expensive and less immediately relevant to survival. Conversely, in a parasympathetic or balanced autonomic state, where heart rate is regulated, breathing is steady, and cortisol is moderated, the brain regains access to executive functions, the capacity for impulse control, goal-directed behavior, memory retrieval, emotional regulation, and social bonding. This is the state where disciplined, deliberate, growth-oriented behaviors become not just possible, but subjectively desirable. In other words, in a calm, alert, centered state, you're far more likely to choose the habits you claim to value: training, reading, creating, connecting, and pursuing meaningful challenges. This is why state before strategy is one of the golden rules in high-performance neuroscience. What's remarkable is that your internal state isn't purely reactive. It's highly modifiable through deliberate inputs. In fact, certain practices can shift your autonomic balance and neurochemical profile within minutes. Controlled breathing is one such tool. Studies from our lab and others have demonstrated that specific breathing protocols like cyclic sighing, which involves 2 short inhales followed by a long, extended exhale, can rapidly decrease sympathetic arousal, lower blood pressure, and reduce anxiety. This simple, accessible tool effectively resets your internal state, shifting you from a reactive, survival-oriented mode into a state where executive control is restored. Another critical variable is light exposure. Your eyes are not just passive cameras, they're extensions of your brain. Specialized cells in your retina, called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, send direct signals to your brain's master clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which governs your circadian rhythm and influences the release of hormones like cortisol and melatonin. When you view bright natural light within the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking, you optimize the timing of cortisol release, which enhances alertness, focus, and mood regulation for the rest of the day. This simple habit can significantly improve your baseline state, increasing the probability that your subsequent behaviors align with your goals rather than your impulses. Movement is another state-modifying lever. Exercise isn't just a physical discipline. It's a neurochemical intervention. Even brief bouts of movement, 2 to 5 minutes of jumping jacks, squats, push-ups, or light jogging, trigger the release of catecholamines like dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. These chemicals sharpen focus, elevate mood, and increase motivation. Regular physical activity also upregulates brain-degraded neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which supports learning, memory, and emotional resilience by promoting the growth and maintenance of neural circuits. In essence, moving your body isn't just about burning calories or building muscle. It's about shifting your internal state to one that is more receptive to positive behaviors and adaptive habits. Social connection is equally potent in this regard. Human beings are biologically wired for connection, and positive social interactions trigger the release of oxytocin and endogenous opioids, which dampen stress circuits and enhance feelings of safety and belonging. Even brief moments of genuine eye contact, laughter, or physical touch with a loved one or trusted friend can shift your neurochemical state, making it easier to access executive functions and to engage in behaviors that require patience, discipline, or courage. Isolation and loneliness, on the other hand, are well-documented stressors that increase sympathetic arousal, dysregulate sleep, and impair cognitive performance. What emerges from this understanding is that you can no longer afford to approach behavior change as a purely cognitive endeavor. If you attempt to install a new habit while your internal state is dominated by stress, exhaustion, or hyperarousal, you are working against your biology. Even if you succeed through sheer force of will, the cost to your nervous system and resilience is substantial. It's far more effective to first shift your state through breathwork, light exposure, movement, or connection, and then, once your system is regulated, initiate the desired behavior. This sequence aligns with what your brain naturally prioritizes. First, assess the internal environment, then determine the appropriate behavioral output. Another fascinating layer here involves attentional control. Your attentional spotlight is tightly coupled to your internal state. In a calm, balanced state, attention becomes more flexible, able to shift between external stimuli and internal thought processes as needed. In a hyper-aroused or fatigued state, attention becomes either excessively vigilant and externally focused, in the case of anxiety, or excessively inward and ruminative, in the case of depression. By deliberately managing your state, you indirectly govern the quality of your attention, which is essential for initiating and sustaining meaningful habits. Attention is the gateway to behavior. You cannot consistently act on what you do not notice or value in the moment. State control sharpens attention, which in turn enables the conscious selection of behaviors aligned with your values. There's also a bidirectional relationship at play. While your state influences your behavior feeds back to modify your state. This means that even small actions, standing up, taking a deep breath, stepping outside for sunlight, drinking water, can initiate a state shift, which then increases the likelihood of more positive behaviors following. This creates what in behavioral science is called a positive feedback loop. One good decision leads to a better internal state, which increases the probability of another good decision, and so on. The compounding effect of these loops over days and weeks is enormous. Sleep is perhaps the most overlooked modulator of state. Sleep deprivation skews your autonomic balance towards sympathetic dominance, impairs prefrontal cortex function, and disrupts the normal rhythms of dopamine and serotonin release. This sets a negative baseline state upon waking, making it far more difficult to engage in disciplined or growth-oriented behaviors. Conversely, even one night of high-quality sleep recalibrates these systems, restoring autonomic flexibility and cognitive control. Managing your state begins the night before through good sleep hygiene practices, consistent bedtimes, dark and cool sleeping environments, and avoiding bright light exposure in the last hour before bed. The final piece to understand is that you are not at the mercy of your state. While it fluctuates naturally, you can become increasingly skilled at detecting when you are in a suboptimal state and intervening early. This requires building interoceptive awareness, the ability to sense internal bodily cues like heart rate, muscle tension, breath depth, and emotional tone. Regular mindfulness or body scanning practices improve this awareness, enabling you to catch the early signs of dysregulation and deploy corrective tools before you derail your behavior. Over time, this turns into a form of self-mastery, where you no longer passively endure your state, but actively sculpt it to serve your values and objectives. The takeaway is clear. Behavior follows state. Discipline follows physiological readiness. Willpower is unreliable in a dysregulated system. By learning to manage your state through breathing, light exposure, movement, sleep, social connection, and awareness, you create the biological and psychological conditions for consistency. And consistency is the gateway to transformation. Your environment is an extension of your nervous system. Design it to reflect your future, not your past. This is a principle rooted not just in psychology or self-help, but in hard neuroscience. The environments we inhabit, the physical spaces, the objects within them, the sounds, the lighting, even the subtle cues embedded in our surroundings, exert a continuous, often unconscious influence on our internal state and behavioral tendencies. The brain is a prediction and pattern detection machine, always scanning for cues about what actions are possible, appropriate, or expected in a given context. Most people underestimate how dramatically their environment shapes their neurobiology and behavior. If you want to reliably adopt new habits or shed dysfunctional patterns, the first and most practical step is to assess and redesign the spaces you inhabit to cue and support those desired behaviors. Consider how the brain processes context. The hippocampus, a brain region central to memory and navigation, contains what are known as place cells, neurons that activate in response to specific environmental locations. Complementing these are grid cells and head direction cells, which together form an internal spatial mapping system. This network doesn't merely help you navigate physical space, it also encodes associations between particular environments and the behaviors historically performed there. If you always eat while watching television on your couch, your brain will form a powerful association between that physical location and the act of mindless eating. The context becomes a cue for habitual behavior, often operating beneath conscious awareness. This is why changing your behavior without altering your environment is often an uphill battle. The neural circuits encoding your old habits are context dependent. You walk into a particular room, hear a familiar sound, or encounter a certain object, and your brain instantly predicts the next likely action based on past patterns. This prediction isn't a vague suggestion. It's a physiological priming of motor and emotional systems to execute that behavior. This is called context-dependent memory retrieval and behavioral priming. If you're trying to install a new habit, such as reading every evening or avoiding your phone first thing in the morning, but the physical environment is saturated with cues for your old behavior, your nervous system will consistently default to the path of least resistance. The solution is to deliberately design your environment to make the desired behavior frictionless and the undesired behavior more difficult. This principle is known in behavioral science as choice architecture. It means structuring your surroundings so that your default, easy options are aligned with your goals. Neuroscience supports this through the concept of decision fatigue and the law of least effort. The brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, has a limited capacity for conscious decision-making and impulse inhibition. As the day progresses, or under conditions of stress and fatigue, the brain increasingly relies on environmental cues and automated patterns to dictate behavior. By preemptively engineering your environment, you bypass the need for constant willpower by letting your surroundings do the cognitive heavy lifting. For example, if you want to consistently perform a morning breathing or meditation practice, place your mat, cushion, or chair in a designated, visible spot where you wake up. The simple visual cue primes the behavior before your rational mind even engages. Studies have shown that even brief exposure to behavior-specific environmental cues can increase the likelihood of performing a desired action by up to 60%. Similarly, if you intend to drink more water, placing a filled glass or bottle on your desk in your direct line of sight dramatically increases consumption. This isn't trivial. These micro-adjustments exploit the brain's tendency to act on what is immediately visible and accessible. Lighting is another profoundly influential environmental variable. Natural light exposure in the morning, as mentioned earlier, anchors your circadian rhythm and modulates cortisol, dopamine, and serotonin levels. But indoor lighting throughout the day can either support or sabotage your alertness, mood, and decision-making. Dim, yellow light in the morning signals to your brain that it's still nighttime, dampening alertness circuits and delaying cortisol release. Conversely, exposure to bright overhead light boosts alertness and primes focus networks in the brain. At night, excessive artificial light, particularly from screens and overhead LEDs, suppresses melatonin and keeps the brain in a hypervigilant state. Modulating your lighting environment using bright, cool light in the morning and warm, dim lighting in the evening entrains your nervous system to a pattern that supports both productive wakefulness and restful sleep. The auditory environment matters just as much. Sound is processed by the auditory cortex and thalamus and then routed to multiple areas of the brain that govern attention, emotion, and memory. Certain sounds, like nature ambiances or specific binaural beats, have been shown to reduce stress and enhance concentration by modulating alpha and theta brainwave activity. Conversely, cluttered auditory environments with frequent notifications, background television, or intrusive conversations fragment attention and increase stress. This fragmentation forces the brain into a reactive mode, impairing executive functions like planning, impulse control, and goal-oriented behavior. By curating your auditory environment using noise-canceling tools, ambient soundscapes, or strategic silence, you can prime your nervous system for calm focus or restful recovery as needed. Effects within your environment also exert a psychological influence. This relates to the concept of affordances, introduced by the psychologist James J. Gibson. An affordance refers to the possible actions an object implies. A closed book on a table affords the action of reading. A pair of running shoes by the door afford the action of exercising. A phone face up on your desk affords the action of checking notifications. By deliberately arranging the affordances within your environment, you guide your future behavior. If you aim to reduce screen time in the evening, charge your phone in another room. If you want to write every morning, leave your notebook open to a fresh page on your desk before bed. These small, physical adjustments create a behavioral gravity, pulling you toward the actions you intend to perform.